Hello, free Colorado. You know, I just came from Washington, D.C., and the news just broke that Joe Biden has spent 38% of his days in the White House out of town on vacation back in Delaware or Camp David. Now, that sounds like he's sloughing off, because if he continues at that rate, he's going to go way beyond what President Trump and President Obama did. But think about this. Just think how much better off we would have been if he had spent 98% of his days on vacation. You know, conservatives in Colorado have for years cared a lot about the candidates they select to run. They haven't spent as much time on the process, the rules by which those candidates run and appear on the ballot. We have to stop that. We have to spend as much time as the left does on the process, because that's how they win. They change and manipulate the rules. Consider in the last few years what they've done in Colorado: the open primary, the national popular vote, massive expansion of mail-in voting so that effectively nobody votes on Election Day. At the same time, they have curbed the right of the citizens to have recall, an initiative, and referendum. This has got to stop. It's time to roll that back. This issue, sadly, has two components to it. On the one side are the American people, 80% of whom back and support sensible election integrity measures. At the same time, something like 90% of the media coverage ignores the fact that there are any problems with our election and claims that it's all a figment of our imagination. Let me tell you very briefly how much the media is keeping from you. We all hear about voter ID, how it's racist, an element of voter suppression, even though voter turnout goes up in states that have voter ID. Well, a few years ago, to their credit, there was a conference in Austin, Texas, and Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter and Martin Luther King III and Andrew Young said, well, let's end this stalemate. We're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on these legal fees. Let's get people an ID. After all, you can't participate in modern life without an ID. You can't apply for Medicare. You can't cash a check. You can't travel. So if someone doesn't have an ID, and not very many people don't, let's get them one. So they came up with an idea. They took it to the Obama White House. They said, the Social Security card that everyone has, for 9 cents we can put a picture on it. Now, we prefer that people use different IDs, but at least it's some form of ID that proves that the person holding the card looks like the person who's trying to vote. They took it to the Obama administration, and Obama's response was, you got to talk to Eric Holder, my Attorney General. And Eric Holder said, well, we'll look at it and get back to you. They never did. So finally, they call up the Justice Department and say, well, have you made up your mind on whether or not you'll support this voter ID law backed by Jimmy Carter and Martin Luther King III and Andrew Young? And the response was, well, we ran it by our liaison with the minority community, and he said, absolutely not. And they said, well, who's your official liaison with the minority community? And they said, Al Sharpton. Has any one of you heard of that story? Another story that hasn't been told by the mainstream media. Lastly, I want to briefly say, you're always going to be accused of racism and voter suppression if you support election integrity measures. Let me tell you the awful truth. The biggest victims of voter fraud in this country are in the minority communities, specifically urban machine areas where the machine holds down the citizens. They get bad roads, bad schools, bad public services. And anytime reformers rise up, they get squashed by the machine using any and all means, including voter fraud. If you don't believe me, I'll refer you to elections in Detroit and Milwaukee and Minneapolis, where voter fraud is rampant and reform-minded members of minority communities are crushed by it. One quick example, St. Louis a few years ago, a guy who used to be a gang member cleaned up his life, opened up his own small business, and he wanted to run to clean up the crime problem in St. Louis. He also wanted to end examples of police brutality. He was a member of Black Lives Matter, but a moderate. he campaigned against the Democratic machine, saying we can have more police and we can have better policing at the same time. Well, the people who ran the police department, the machine, didn't want any change. So he ran against this 75-year-old representative named Mother Hubbard, Old Mother Hubbard they called her, and in the Democratic primary for a state legislative seat. Well, election day comes, he wins at the polling place, but the absentee ballots go 90% against him, and he loses by 90 votes. So he went to court, and apparently the machine messed up so badly, the proof was for once everywhere, that a federal judge stepped in, threw the election out, and ordered a new primary 6 weeks later. Same candidates, same district, same set of issues. And you know what? He won 73% of the vote in the runoff. 73%. I just want to know how much fraud there really was in that original race, because at least there were federal monitors at the second election. This is just an example of why we cannot trust the mainstream media's narrative on this. We have to build our own news sources. We have to read books like the ones that Hans and I have. You have to look at things like the Heritage Foundation's website that Hans has built, and you have to educate yourself on this. Don't be intimidated by people who call you racist. Look at them and say, don't be intimidated by people who call you racist. They have nothing else to defend themselves over. They just hurl names at you. And in the end, we can have, ultimately, elections that are both free and fair. In 2002, we did pass a bipartisan voting reform act called the Help America Vote Act, and it made it easy to vote and hard to cheat. We need to do that again. We need to outlast the left until we break them, until they realize that their campaign to federalize elections and take them away from the states will always fail, like it failed last year in Washington. And when we do that, then we can have some real compromise. And until then, we have to fight like heck to make sure that our elections are free and fair and fraud is gone. Thank you.
All right, I could talk about this for hours, but I only have a few minutes, so I'll overcome my Southern heritage and try to speak really fast. Let me read a quote from you that emphasizes something that John said, which is that people who want to steal elections and set out to steal elections really concentrate on the poor and the elderly. This is a quote from a case from the Indiana State Supreme Court when they confirmed overturning an election in East Chicago, Indiana, which from its name you can probably tell East Chicago, they were following the way things are done in Chicago because of massive absentee ballot fraud. And who did the conspirators target? First-time voters or otherwise less informed voters, those lacking in knowledge of the voting process, the infirm, the poor, and those with limited skills in the English language. 10 years ago, 4 individuals, including a local campaign consultant, were convicted in Troy, New York, of engaging in absentee ballot fraud. They went into this one particular neighborhood and stole the absentee ballots out of people's mailboxes, plus they sent in requests for absentee ballots on behalf of voters, forging their signatures. The voters had no idea this had been done. One of the guys who was convicted was interviewed by the local police, and they asked him, why'd you pick this particular low-income, low-housing neighborhood? And he said, well, because this has been going on for a very long time, and we think these are the people who are least likely to complain about it or to notice what we've done. And that confirms for you that this happens. I don't know, and this has been with us for a long time. I don't know if you all realize this, but when George Washington first ran for office for the House of Burgess in Virginia, which is the oldest state legislature in North America, he won. And one of the reasons he won is that, he made his own whiskey. I don't know if y'all realize this, but the ladies who run Mount Vernon a couple years ago discovered his whiskey recipe in the archives, and there is now a small distillery at Mount Vernon making his whiskey. But he won his election because he provided free whiskey to voters to entice them to vote for him. James Madison thought this was disgusting and unethical, and he refused to do it, and he lost his first race. Now, when I tell folks that, they say, well, that's ancient history. Okay, you want something more recent? Just this week, a judge overturned a city council race in Compton, California, due to voter registration and absentee ballot fraud. 3 individuals have already pleaded guilty to this. And one of the members of the city council, who is no longer a member of the city council, is also under criminal indictment. He's going to trial. You know how many, what the margin of victory was in his election? 1 vote. And that confirms for you something that's very important. We have close elections all the time in this country. You know, folks are constantly talking about national elections and, oh, you know, tens of thousands of votes. But when you look at our elections, we have elections constantly at the local and state level, city council, town council, county commissioners, and in those elections, a very small number of votes is often the margin of victory, and so it doesn't take a lot to cheat. By the way, also on Thursday, what's today, Saturday? On Thursday, a Democratic activist in Arizona pleaded guilty to illegal vote trafficking. You know what the left tries to call vote harvesting. That makes it sound better. Vote trafficking, you know what she was doing? Going around collecting absentee ballots from voters illegally and apparently often filling out the ballot herself rather than the voter doing it. If you get into an argument with a liberal over election fraud, I would suggest 2 things. One, you can either refer them to our most current book or our last book in which we detail proven cases of fraud, or send them to the election fraud database that we maintain at the Heritage Foundation. It's unique. It's the only one in the country, and we only put proven cases of fraud in there. We just added half a dozen cases. We're up to, I think, 1,357 cases, but I can tell you that's just the tip of the iceberg, because often, too often, local prosecutors don't want to investigate and prosecute these cases. And I'm going to want to give you one quick example that demonstrates this. I'm on the board of another organization, the Public Interest Legal Foundation. And we did something very interesting after the 2020 election. We sent a request under state records laws, FOIA laws, to the 10 biggest counties in Florida, and we said, we want your files on all criminal referrals that your local county election officials sent to your local prosecutor because they uncovered evidence of election fraud related to the 2020 election. 9 of the 10 counties got back to us and said, we sent 156 criminal referrals to local prosecutors. Now, I'm a former election official in 2 separate counties, one in Virginia, one in Georgia. I can tell you, election officials, they're not going to send a file to a DA unless they have substantive evidence that fraud occurred. 156 cases were referred. So then we checked court records and we checked the DA's offices to find out, well, how many of those were actually investigated and prosecuted by local DAs. Anybody care to guess how many cases were followed up on? 0. Remember I said 9 out of 10 counties responded? Turned out the 10th county, Hillsborough County, responded to us and said, oh, we never send criminal referrals to the local DA. Look, you've been hearing now all day and yesterday, I think, at this conference from people talking to you about important substantive issues. You know, everything from school choice to all of the issues that determine the important public policies of this country, even economic policies, foreign policy, everything else. All those issues are really important. But the only way we're going to get the kind of public policy we want on all of these issues is if we are able to elect good people, principled individuals who are going to do something about this the way we want them to do it. And they're not going to get elected just because they have good ideas and people support them. They're only going to get elected if we have election rules that are fair and honest and that protect not just access, which is the only thing the progressive left wants, but also security. You've heard the phrase constantly, easy to vote, hard to cheat, but that should be the goal. And the thing is, what you all need to understand is the American public is on our side on this. Despite what you read in the press, despite what you hear or see on MSNBC if you're forced to watch it, the polling shows that overwhelmingly Americans support common sense reform like voter ID, no matter which political party they support and no matter their race or ethnicity. In fact, when John and I were doing our first book, we had a poll done, and you know what it showed? It showed, for example, that African Americans are more concerned about voter fraud than anyone else. And the reason goes back to what we said at the beginning, because they too often see it in their neighborhoods because they're being taken advantage of. The one thing I will tell you is that we are actually in better shape today than we were in the 2020 election. And here's why. The 2020 election finally made a lot of state legislators realize, boy, we actually have problems. We need to fix some of the holes in our system, holes that John and I have been preaching about for more than a decade. They finally realized they needed to fix these problems, plus the grassroots rose up. The same way parents started showing up at school boards, thank goodness, all across the country, particularly in places like Virginia, folks started paying attention to this, the public, and also talking to their state legislators and saying, you better do something about this. The result is that in 2021, a year ago, almost 24 states passed all these reforms, good reforms to improve the system. You heard them being attacked. You heard Texas being attacked, Georgia being attacked, because they did something as common sense as saying that when you vote, you not only have to show an ID when you vote in person, but they extended it to absentee ballots. Now, you all know that the President Biden went down to Atlanta and just raged against this. This was Jim Crow 2.0, asking people to show an ID, and if you support that, why, you're the same as Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy. Okay, well, what did the people of Georgia just do in their primary? Proved him totally wrong. In fact, if we could see him at Camp David, we would see him eating crow, because the turnout of the voters there, all voters, white voters, Hispanic voters, African American voters, they reached records. They had more turnout than in the 2020 election, presidential election, the primary. You know how unusual that is? Congressional elections, turnout's always lower. They had higher turnout. So once again, it showed that the American people, all of them, no matter which political party they support, are a lot smarter than the politicians in Washington think they are, or the people who write the editorial pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times. I want to end with this. In 2005, you all may recall, after the Florida election, Jimmy Carter, former Democratic president, and James Baker, former Republican Secretary of State, actually formed a commission to look at federal election reform. I was actually consulted on that as one of the experts, and they came out with bipartisan solutions, which were good recommendations, including requiring an ID. And in that report, they said this, and I absolutely think this is right. Elections are the heart of democracy. They are the instrument for the persons to choose leaders and hold them accountable. At the same time, elections are a core public function upon which all other government responsibilities depend. If elections are defective, the entire democratic system is at risk. And what I would ask all of you and urge all of you to do is get involved in this. Be a poll watcher for whatever candidate you like. Get a job working in a polling place. get appointed to your local county election board that runs elections so you can help make sure they do the right thing, and talk to your legislators about improving the election rules in your state. Thanks.